vampire descending on innocent mortals at night. Is this just a blood-curdling fantasy, the figment of a writer's morbid imagination? A disturbing discovery in Central Europe reveals clues to the true story behind Dracula. Scientific evidence points to a very different vampire than the one the world knows so well. A vampire who is not a count, not from Transylvania, and not a man. Who was the vampire princess? During road work in the Bohemian town of Český Krumlov, a team of Czech archaeologists uncovers an 18th century graveyard containing the remains of 11 men and women. Three of the skeletons are buried in strange ways. This captures the attention of Dr. Michel Erny from the Archaeological Institute of Prague. In Christian burials, bodies are aligned along an east-west axis. Most of the skeletons here conform to that tradition. But three are placed north-south. And there are other details that strike the team as unusual. One skeleton has its skull severed and placed between its legs, and there's a stone between its jaws. The limbs of all three skeletons have been pinned down with flat, heavy stones. The mysterious graves were found inside the borders of Český Krumlov, quite close to the town center, which is dominated by a sprawling palace. Český Krumlov lies in the very center of Europe, in the Czech Republic near the Austrian border. Michel Erny's team takes 4 of the skeletons to Prague for an anthropological analysis. It's an exciting find for Rainer Kuppel, a media studies professor at Vienna University. Kuppel studies the origins of the vampire myth, which can be traced to a real vampire scare in the 18th century, when it was rumored that bodies were impaled and beheaded to prevent them from rising. Until now, no one had found archaeological evidence of vampires.
Today, most people are familiar with these rituals from Hollywood movies and vampire stories. Perhaps the discoveries in Český Krumlov provide us with archaeological evidence of the historical practice of warding off vampires.
3 Krumlov skeletons bear the distinctive signs of vampire rituals described so vividly in Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. To learn more about the finds, Rainer Kuppel travels to Prague to interview Michel Erny.
Dr. Erny, this is an interesting animation. Can you describe the situation on site?
Among the 11 skeletons, 3 were buried in a north-south direction, which is unusual.
The stones we see, were they on top of the bones or on the graves?
The stones were inside the graves. They were originally placed on the skeletons. On the skeletons or on the coffins.
Scientific analysis shows that the 3 skeletons are male. One has a gap in his teeth, probably from excessive pipe smoking. From the skeleton with its head between its legs, the top 3 vertebrae of the neck are missing. This would be typical of a ritual decapitation, performed on bodies to prevent their resurrection as vampires.
This is a rare and very exciting find. During the first half of the 18th century, there was a widespread vampire scare. Simple folk were digging up graves all over the countryside and found undecomposed bodies.
To villagers, an undecomposed body was the sign of a vampire.
Simple folk had their own ways to deal with these unholy creatures, digging up the graves, decapitating the corpses, driving stakes through their hearts, and then burning them.
The word vampire first entered the German language in 1732, at the height of a vampire frenzy that had spread through vast areas of Europe. Vampires were blamed for all kinds of diseases and epidemics, but digging up suspected vampires was not condoned by the authorities.
Burning bodies in the middle of the night at a cemetery would cause attraction, sometimes too much attraction. That is why people developed less spectacular methods to make sure that the vampires would stay in their graves and coffins forever.
To neutralize a vampire, its vital center had to be destroyed.
Unearthing them, driving stakes through their hearts, decapitating them, and then placing the skulls between the legs.
There was a risk of the undead reaching for its head and placing it back on the neck.
Putting a stone between the jaws to make sure that the corpses could not start to chew, which was thought to be the first step of turning into a vampire again.
The hands were tied with a rosary. Heavy stones were placed on the arms and legs to immobilize the undead.
Evidence proves that exactly these measures have been taken against these 3 bodies. So obviously, they were suspected to be vampires.
But do these skeletons really date from the early 18th century vampire hysteria? And were they really impaled? At Vienna University's Department of Forensic Medicine, Dr. Christian Reiter will examine the skeletons. First, he has to determine how old the bones are. He extracts a sample for a nitrogen analysis. The result is astonishing. The skeletons have been underground for about 3 centuries, which would put the date of burial roughly between 1700 and 1750, precisely the period of Europe's vampire frenzy.
What's unusual about this one is the absence of 3 cervical vertebrae. The person was either hanged or he hanged himself and then dropped to the ground in the process of decomposition, so that parts of the cervical spine were lost, or he was beheaded. This skeleton here is practically complete. No parts of the cervical spine are missing. But a closer look at the sternum reveals a rather unusual mark. You can see a rounded indenture here with crumbling edges just like the rest of the bone. A pointed object hitting the sternum exactly in the region above the heart. One may assume that in this case, the dead body has been impaled.
This is the first time that archaeological evidence of an 18th century vampire ritual has been discovered. It's a sensational find. The vampire frenzy wasn't confined to commoners. Soon, scientists and other learned men began to investigate the phenomenon. Graves were opened, coffins were removed, and bodies were inspected. What they found could only be explained by vampirism. Symptoms that no properly dead person should display. One of the best-known vampire commissioners was Dr. Franz von Gersthoff. In a report, he describes one of his inspections.
The grave of one Dorothea Fies, who was buried for 128 days, has been opened. Although the face was decomposed, the hands and feet were as those of a living person. The upper body, too, was perfectly intact, and there was fresh blood on the shroud.
It would not be the only discovery of a corpse lying in its grave looking fat and with rosy skin. The fingernails and the hair also seem to have grown. In the 18th century, these were all symptoms of a vampire. But modern science can explain them all.
These are phenomena caused by the decomposition process. Decomposition gases fill the body cavities, pumping them up and giving the impression that even skinny bodies have become well nourished. The corpses often lose blood, especially from the openings in the face. Nails and hair do not really continue growing. Rather, the surrounding skin shrinks, making them appear more prominent.
Vampires were said to make a smacking sound in the grave. How do you explain that?
Decomposition fluids are forced out through the mouth and the nose, and gas bubbles from the digestive tract, and the lungs rise within them. This can cause a blubbering noise. If you approach such a corpse, you can hear these noises even through the coffin.
All the alleged vampires had one thing in common. They were poor, often from the very fringes of society. So how come the most famous one was an aristocrat, Count Dracula?
Dracula is the most widely known vampire. Dracula has become a synonym for all vampires. But the novel Dracula is clearly based on historical sources and traditions. However, in one decisive point, Bram Stoker departs from historical sources and documents. His vampire is a count, a nobleman who lives in a castle. Stoker's novel begins with a note who left Munich at 8:35 p.m. on the 1st of May. But originally, Stoker wanted to begin his novel with a spectacular vampire attack that took place the night before.
The attack begins at the tomb of an Austrian princess. When the hero, Jonathan Harker, approaches, a female vampire rises from the grave. Harker passes out. When he awakens, a wolf is sitting on his chest, keeping his blood warm for the vampire.
Stoker mentions an inscription on the backside of the princess's tomb. The dead travel fast is a quote from an old German ballad written in the 18th century, which is considered to be one of the earliest references to the undead. The ballad was written by Gottfried August Birger and is entitled Lenore. Lenore is about a bride who curses heaven because her husband was killed at war. Eventually he returns, but he is undead. We will not ride till midnight. I hail from far Bohemia. I left long after daylight, and I wish to take you with me. These clues lead us to Bohemia, where the vampire skeletons were discovered. Is there also evidence pointing to a vampire of noble ancestry?
Today's Český Krumlov is unique in Central Europe. Nestled into a scenic bend of the Moldava River, the original town center is perfect. perfectly intact. Above the town towers one of Central Europe's largest and most spectacular palaces. The palace, too, is well preserved. It used to be the administrative center of the entire region, a densely wooded, windswept plateau. This is where Rainer Kuppel begins his research.
Originally, Stoker sets the first chapter of Dracula on a windswept plateau. In this chapter, he writes about wolves and a vampire in the vault of an Austrian princess. He even gives us a clue about the name of the vampire, Lenore. The vampire skeletons found in Český Krumlov date to the early 18th century. Tradition has it that the most dangerous vampires were members of the aristocracy. We are now here to find out who ruled this castle at the beginning of the 18th century.
Is there a connection between the three vampire skeletons, the hints in Stoker's novel, and events in Krumlov Castle? Rainer Kuppel's research begins in the castle's archive. 6 miles of shelves are stored in the castle vaults. There are countless documents here that have never been scientifically examined. What's so unique about this archive is that the events of nearly every single day have been meticulously documented for centuries. It's a trove of secrets. In his search, Rainer Kuppel stumbles upon an extraordinary coincidence. A name very similar to Lenora.
An Austrian princess named Eleonore resided at this castle at the time of the great vampire hysteria.
Krumlov in the first half of the 18th century, the Baroque period. A time of stark contrasts. While the vast majority of the population lived in absolute poverty, the aristocracy reveled in luxury. Bitter misery and lavish extravagance were often just a few steps apart. Among the most prominent aristocrats, Princess Eleonora Amalie von Schwarzenberg. A princess from Baden, near Vienna, she had married Prince Adam Franz Schwarzenberg in 1701. Their life was filled with gala receptions and glittering parties. But Eleonora's fate was to take several dramatic turns. Could she be Bram Stoker's model for Count Dracula? And if so, how? Eleonora was a passionate huntress. Her passion for hunting was even greater than her husband's. In the Bohemian countryside, she organized huge hunting parties for social entertainment. On such occasions, the gentry shot practically anything that moved. But one animal, greatly feared at the time, was off limits to Eleonora. The wolf. She needed wolves alive for an unusual practice. They were to help her give birth to a son and heir. For years, Eleonora had tried to get pregnant with no success. She turned to a method handed down from antiquity. She drank wolf's milk, which was believed to enhance fertility. Across Europe, since the Middle Ages, wolves were believed to be in alliance with evil, with Satan. They were thought to have been sent by evil spirits and to help vampires. Eleonora drank the milk for years. Such was the pressure to give birth to a male heir. Finally, she was redeemed. At age 41, she gave birth to a son.
Eleonore bore an heir to the von Schwarzenberg family at an age when it was no longer considered possible for a woman to give birth. At that time, it was considered either a medical miracle or witchcraft.
In the years after her son's birth, Eleonora's life took a dramatic turn. In 1732, the same year the word vampire appeared in the German language, her husband was shot during a hunt near Prague. As a result, her son did not grow up with her, but with the emperor in Vienna. As compensation, Eleonora received an annual allowance of 5,000 guilders, about $200,000. But this amount was not nearly enough to cover her expenses. Again and again, she was threatened by bill collectors, according to documents in the palace archive. Expensive wines, tobacco, jewelry, and most of all, the high cost of medicines and strange occult practices must have damaged her reputation with the aristocratic society in Vienna. Eleonora was clearly superstitious. As she grew older, her obsession with the occult grew. But how would a bohemian princess, no matter how strange, somehow become seen as a vampire? At Krumlov Castle, a so-called magic scroll is kept until this day. A paper scroll containing symbols and incantations to fend off evil spirits. The symbols were copied and displayed in places where the holder wanted special protection. Often this ritual was associated with medical treatments. Physically, Eleonora rapidly declined during her lonely years at Krumlov Castle. She had constant visits from physicians to relieve her ailments. Among them were the most prominent doctors of her time. But in Eleonora's time, medical standards were not very high. Her most frequent treatment was bloodletting. This was to purify the body and remove evil juices from the system. Generally, rather than improving a person's health, medical treatment made things worse. The physicians of the early 18th century operated in a gray area between science, superstition, and magic. Eleonora's doctors prescribed numerous and often strange medications from Vienna and Prague, shown by detailed records in the archive. Dr. Krista Kletter is familiar with most of these medications. She's an expert in pharmaceutical history at Vienna University.
Dr. Kletter, here's a list from the Krumlov Castle archive. It includes strange substances such as crayfish eyes, cetaceum, and even unicorn horn. What's the story behind these things?
These are fanciful names of typical 18th century medications. Take crayfish eyes, for instance. These are not really eyes, but deposits found in the stomachs of river crayfish. They were used for acid therapy, ridding the body of destructive acids. Another substance is cetaceum or spermaceti, a wax-like substance from the cranial cavities of sperm whales. This was used until far into the 20th century as an ingredient for various ointments.
What about the unicorn?
Unicorn horn is a magic substance. Unicorns, of course, never existed. What we see here are either fossil mammoth teeth or narwhal tusks. Magic potions were very popular. It was believed that they enhanced the potency of medicines.
So what would have been her ailments?
She probably endured great pain from severe colic attacks. What seems abnormal is the enormous variety of medications, a really incredible number on certain days.
The pharmacy order for April 30th, 1739, for instance, lists 60 preparations. April 30th is a special date. It's Walpurgis Night, the night of witches and ghosts. Eleonora kept experimenting with various substances. She clung to every straw, but her condition worsened steadily. To the people around her in a time of vampire scares, her symptoms must have seemed increasingly suspicious. White skin, emaciated, with no record of an actual illness. Eleonora's health declined dramatically, and she was already marked by death when she moved from Krumlov to Vienna, where she expected to get better medical treatment. The arduous trip was a last desperate attempt to save her life, but Eleonora's days were numbered. In the spring of 1741, the princess lay on her deathbed. All the doctors appeared puzzled. The archives contained no diagnosis of her ailment. Did no one want to talk about it? Did the doctors assume a supernatural cause? On May 5th, 1741, at 6 in the morning, Eleonora died at the Schwarzenberg Palace in Vienna.
Immediately after her death, an autopsy was performed on her corpse, and we have found the original autopsy report in the archives of the castle. Hopefully this document will give us more information on her medical history and the cause of death.
The autopsy report describes the body's condition with great precision. Only 9 hours after Eleonora's death, the Empire's leading physicians assembled for a post-mortem.
Today, May 5th, 1741, at 3 o'clock post-meridium, the princess's body was opened, where it was found, even outwardly, the entire body, including all 4 extremities, was utterly emaciated. Below the intestines, the above-mentioned growth was found, of the size of an average child's head.
The cost of the autopsy has also been documented. The doctor's honorary fee is recorded in the account book at 3,000 guilders.
An equivalent today of $130,000, an exorbitant amount. Rainer Koppel confronts the forensic expert Christian Reiter with the autopsy report.
Dr. Reiter, here we have an autopsy report from 1741, the post-mortem of an 18th century princess. Was that unusual?
Yes, this was something very unusual because at the time, postmortems were not performed on aristocrats. Also, the fee that was paid does in no way relate to the work involved. Either the fee was so high because there was a great risk involved, for instance of an infection, or it was sort of hush money. What is missing in this report is the cause of death. However, from this description we can draw very clear conclusions about the princess's disease. She had a tumor in the left minor pelvis, which had engendered metastases in the pleura and the solar plexus.
The autopsy report and the castle archives paint a dramatic picture of Eleonora's final days. From August 1740, 1 year before her death, she must have deteriorated rapidly. The growths in her lungs take away her breath. She suffers from severe colic attacks and pains in the lower body. Her extremities ache. She loses weight and appetite. The people around her see her emaciation as if her body were losing blood from day to day.
From today's perspective, we can clearly say, based on the post-mortem report, that the woman died of cancer.
But if the report states no cause of death, what was the purpose of the post-mortem?
It is conceivable that one of the princess's physicians, who had been dealing with the vampire epidemic, saw the cause of her sickness in a vampire infection. Doctors always diagnose the things that are on their minds.
We know from correspondence that Eleonora often asked for Dr. Franz von Gerstoff.
Vienna, April 30th. From a depesche that arrived this morning, I have been informed that Her Highness, the Princess of Krumau, is indisposed, for which reason I will immediately make arrangements for the Imperial Personal Medicus Dr. Gerstoff to travel to Her Highness.
Gerstoff was the personal physician of Emperor Charles VI. He also headed numerous commissions investigating vampires. Like many doctors of his time, Dr. Gerstoff was convinced that vampirism was contagious. Eleonora's condition fit the pattern of vampire epidemics: emaciation, anemia, mental disorientation. If her doctors believed Eleonora was becoming a vampire, the mysterious autopsy following her death might not have been an autopsy at all. It might have been an intervention, a ritual designed to prevent the vampire from rising from the dead.
If there was a suspicion of the princess suffering from vampirism, the post-mortem may have had the purpose of neutralizing a vampire. To do the same thing in a post-mortem, that would have been done in a vampire execution. It would have been unthinkable to subject a princess to a crude impaling, even to neutralize her as a vampire. A scientific autopsy could achieve the same end with more dignity. In every post-mortem, the heart is taken out and opened, which has the same effect as impaling the heart.
If the doctors were so alarmed, imagine the fears of the people of Český Krumlov in the days leading up to Eleonora's death. If an aristocrat could be infected by vampirism, that meant another vampire must be in the vicinity, one so powerful he could even infect a princess. The castle is locked up. Night guards are installed to watch the building around the clock. Throughout the region, there's a mood of fear and helplessness born by ignorance, as the great vampire hysteria rages. All across the land, the bodies of suspected vampires burn. In the palace, the princess's disease becomes more and more threatening. At night she lies awake, her heart racing and short of breath. She suffers from restlessness and panic attacks. Did she feel persecuted by vampires? Was she afraid of becoming one herself? If this Bohemian princess was indeed the inspiration for Count Dracula, a real-life vampire, the real story would have to begin with her death. Traditionally, the Schwarzenbergs were buried in the family tomb in St. Augustine's Church in Vienna. Eleonora's husband was buried here. Father Alban Scheuch, the archive keeper, oversees the books of the dead.
May I ask you to hold the monastery chronicles for a moment, so I can have a look on the book of the dead? Here we have the complete list of those buried here. 14 names are listed. It's striking that one lady of the Schwarzenberg family, Eleonore Amalie Magdalene, is mentioned, although she's not buried here. It is stated that she was buried in Bohemia, according to her own wish. Here in the monastery chronicles is a hint, very interesting, because normally something like this would not be mentioned in the chronicles. But the keeper of the archive at the time devotes half a page to the death of Eleonore Schwarzenberg. That she died on May 5th, and according to her own wish, her body was returned to Bohemia that same night to be buried.
The transfer of the body from Vienna to Krumlov is decreed in the will. It was written only a few days before her death, and it's questionable whether the document truly reflects her personal wish.
Secondly, my body, whether I leave this earth in Vienna or elsewhere, is to be transferred to Krumlov, and there to be borne to St. Nepomuk's church by poor people, to be buried there without pomp and circumstance. The following shall be inscribed on my gravestone. Here lies the poor sinner Eleonore. Pray for her.
Why would a dead princess be rushed away at night hundreds of miles from her family tomb to a remote province? Was it the fear that she could turn into a vampire in the very heart of Vienna and spread her infection throughout the capital?
The dead travel fast is the refrain in Bürger's Lenore. The dead travel fast is the inscription on the mysterious tombstone in Dracula's Guest. And when Dracula himself first appears in the novel, somebody whispers, "The dead travel fast." And the dead Princess Eleonore traveled fast too, on her way from Vienna, where she died, to Český Krumlov, where she was buried.
The funeral in Krumlov, too, departed from the pattern of the high aristocracy. All over the country, hundreds of masses were read for Eleonora. Her body was laid out at St. George's Chapel in the castle. Not a single member of the high aristocracy or the high clergy participated in her funeral. The front pew remained empty. It was reserved for Eleonora's son, but he failed to appear. The actual burial took place on May 10th in the Church of St. Vitus in Krumlov. Eleonora was buried at night. At 8 o'clock, the funeral train set out from the castle to the church. It was lined by the people of Krumlov and numerous monks and nuns with candles and torches. In her will, Eleonora had expressed the wish that the poor of Krumlov should participate in her funeral.
Historical documents tell us that this is the final resting place of Eleonore von Schwarzenberg. She was buried in the side chapel of the church.
However, there is no sign of her grave. The priest has given permission to look under this carpet. It hasn't been lifted in decades. It reveals a tombstone in the floor.
Underneath the skull and bones, we read the date of her death, the 5th of May, in the year 1741.
There is no reference to her aristocratic title or her family name on the tombstone, nor the usual coat of arms. Only the mysterious inscription of the poor sinner.
There's something mysterious about this tomb. We know that all the other members of the Schwarzenberg dynasty are buried in the family vault in Vienna. Eleonora is the only one who was buried here. There's an old vampire legend about the Masticatione Mortorum, in English about the chewing dead. The chewing dead start to eat their shroud and then attack the corpses next to them. Maybe that's why the family wanted to make sure that Eleonore is buried far away from them.
The return of the dead princess must have been a shock for the people of Krumlov. Rumors about vampires must have raced through town. Who had infected Eleonora, and where might they strike next? The people rushed out in search of vampires. Houses were barricaded. Garlic and crosses were displayed for protection.
The vampire hunt led them to the cemetery, where they found what they were looking for.
What they found that night could explain the 3 skeletons that would be unearthed by archaeologists 2.5 centuries later. If a black horse shied at a grave, it was said to contain a vampire. This could have happened not once, but 3 times. 3 coffins unearthed. The mob could have carried the coffins to the abandoned cemetery and performed the vampire rituals at the very spot where the archaeologists would eventually dig. But there's another explanation for how the people of Krumlov could have found their vampires. People who committed suicide were often regarded as vampires. The chronicles tell of 3 suicides during Eleonora's time: Paul Haas, Philip Bauer, and Urban Filler. Paul Haas had hanged himself. It's possible that this is his severed head placed between his legs. But what about Eleonora's burial? After her death in 1741, she was lost from history. But her grave may deliver up one final clue. Was she given the burial of an aristocrat or a vampire? A georadar reveals an anomaly. A strange bulge-like pattern just a few inches beneath the tombstone, above where the coffin should be. It suggests a solid structure covering the coffin. To find out what it is, the scientists get permission to remove the tombstone and dig. They're about to do precisely what the people of Český Krumlov feared the most. As the scientists begin to uncover the grave, they immediately discover something else. Fragments of human bones. Eleonora's grave has been covered with cemetery soil, its holy ground, sacred earth. They now realize that beneath the soil is a cement cage. They drill through the cement and and prepare to lower a camera into the tomb. 2.5 centuries after her hasty nighttime burial, the camera reveals the coffin of the vampire princess. The investigation shows that Eleonora's people took no chances. Her coffin was walled in, buried under sanctified soil, and sealed by a massive tombstone. They wanted to make sure that she would never escape. In the years after Eleonora's death, the vampire hysteria reached such extremes that Empress Maria Theresa's personal physician, the great medical reformer Gerhard van Swieten, was sent to Bohemia in 1755 on a vampire reconnaissance mission. He concluded that vampires only appear where ignorance still reigns, and that there was no evidence of their real existence. He shone the light of science on vampirism. The age of reason had reached the eastern edges of the Austrian Empire. Based on his report, Maria Theresa decreed that all measures against vampires, decapitation, impalement, or burning of bodies, should cease. Vampire stories moved from the real world to fiction.
Legends and horror stories often have historical roots. The historical site of the vampire myth does not lie in distant Transylvania, but here, in the heart of Europe.
And the vampire rituals from Eleonora's day were known by Bram Stoker when, in 1890, he began to write his novel, Dracula. Stoker would create the world's most famous image of a vampire, Count Dracula. But he removed the vampire princess who was in the original version of the book. Why? No one knows. Stoker based his vampire hunter, Van Helsing, on the Austrian investigator Gerhard van Swieten. Stoker's story was not simply an act of imagination. It was well-grounded in historical facts. A real vampire hysteria, real rituals created to defeat the demons, and a real woman, a vampire princess, whose story would be buried and long forgotten, but eventually would rise.